Welcome back, everyone, to Enterprise Security Weekly. That's right. This week, I sit down with Michael Santarcangelo and Jeff Mann to talk about multi-factor authentication in the enterprise, because this show is very enterprise-focused. I've worked at many enterprises that had two-factor authentication. Are
we talking two-factor or multi-factor?
I don't know. I put multi-factor to open it up so that we could talk about two-factor or three-factor.
Why don't we go back old school? We'll call it strong.
Strong? Strong factor?
You guys remember that? Are you too young for that, Paul?
I don't remember. Strong factor authentication?
We called it two-factor. We called it strong authentication.
Oh, I see. I see.
That came and went pretty quickly.
So,
yeah, it only lasted a decade. I mean, you're a little older than it. So maybe in your scope of time, Jeff.
It came and went in my scope of time, is what I'm saying.
Let's open up with Michael's trademark question. What is the problem we're trying to solve?
Does that mean Michael has to answer it?
Michael or Jeff?
Michael's normally the one asking it, but look, I'll take a stab.
Turn the tables on you.
We can hop in on it. Well, but I think that's an important thing because a lot of people separate out, we need to separate out. A lot of people conflate identification, authentication, and authorization together, and they're not. So when we talk about two-factor or multi-factor authentication, right? Identification is who you claim to be. Authentication is proof, and authorization is what you're allowed to do. Now, a lot of our systems tie those things together. And so when you get to it, there's still three factors of authentication: something that you know, something that you have, something that you are. And multi-factor means you're using two or more of those factors.
Which is also the definition of two-factor authentication. So, I don't know when the use of the term multi-factor came into play. Actually, I think I know when it came into play.
Well, let me ask you differently. Have you seen a situation where you have all three? Because I haven't.
No, I don't think I ever have.
Nothing definitive anyway that I've seen that.
And what I have seen more often than not is, sometimes a really cool second factor that is essentially the same as the first factor.
Right.
And so I used to have to, talk customers through,
it
looks really cool, but
passwords is still two passwords.
It's still two passwords. I think multi-factor.
A lot of people have gotten that wrong.
Multi-factor, I think, is more of a marketing term that came about, and I honestly don't recall who coined it, but I think it was some apps, primarily e-commerce banking apps.
Because I always thought of...
I was just going to say, Jeff, that's right. So if you go back to 2006, 2007, when the FFIEC, the FIFIC came out, this is when they made a push. And if you go read their original docs, they actually said, we want strong authentication.
Right.
And then they changed it to, they might have actually started doing a multi-factor there. But just as the quick history, what happened was we looked at trust in banking. So they said, gosh, we need people doing online banking. That's going to power our commerce. That's important to us. We need to keep it protected. So, hey, banks, you guys got to do something about this. So go take a look at it.
Yep.
And I actually thought it was good guidance that they offered. A lot of people were so busy, just tell me the answer, man. Just tell me what I'm supposed to do. Somebody came out and said, doing real two-factor, we can't roll that out. People don't know how to use that. Why don't we do, and they started to call something multi-layer, which is what you just described, Jeff. So, but what they would say is, instead, this is where that stupid picture thing came in.
Yes, I was just going to say that, Michael.
Then I'm going to present you with a picture that you selected, and we'll call that good.
Right.
Most of us looked at that and just shook our heads like
those
dogs.
are still just two. Those are just still two things I always thought of two-factor as something you have and something you know.
Yeah, it has to.
Or something you are.
Right. And something you are, who you are, I guess.
Which introduces the concept of any kind of biometric.
Right.
Something about your person, something that you are.
So
I don't think there's any variations to those three factors. I've never heard of any.
Every now and then try to suggest that location should be a factor, or there's another one now that I hear people try to introduce in. But it's kind of like anytime somebody wants to argue the AIC or CIA triad, depending on how you learned it. There are three factors. Let's not get fancy with it. There are three factors. Period.
because where you are can be spoofed, and I mean, and people's smartphones have played into this two-factor thing, right? So if I need my fingerprint to unlock my phone, to get into the app that generates the secure code that I have to put in addition to my password, does that cover all the bases? Because the fingerprint is part of me, right? The phone is something I have.
If the finger happens to be attached to
there's lots of attack points in there, but fundamentally, if my fingerprint unlocks my phone has the app that generates the code, and I put in a password, does that hit all the areas, the 3 different areas that Michael talked about in the beginning?
Perhaps.
Or is it too flimsy? Is it too easy to get my phone and image it and break my fingerprint?
You know, we could always argue there's ways around all of them.
Right.
You know, so, you know, there is no perfect solution, but there's reasonable solutions for solving the problem that we're trying to solve, which we haven't actually articulated yet. So let me take a stab at it. A higher level of degree of confidence that you are who you claim to be.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I like that higher degree of confidence thing.
Well, yeah, no, and that's the right way to think about it. Let's go back a second, though, right? So assuming you did your identity proofing to a level that you liked, and that's what you assign the authentication to, then yes, then there are situations in which you wanted a higher degree of confidence than not. But it doesn't mean two-factor has to work for everything. So I think the thing to point out is that if you're looking at a two-factor authentication mechanism, the first question is why? I'm not saying it's bad, but it kind of goes back to what Jeff just said. So do you want a higher level of assurance that the person who's logging in is who they say they are, who they claim to be? Okay, cool. Then that's a good solution. Are you doing it because everybody else told you to do it because that's what all the cool enterprises are doing?
Can you do it successfully to prevent people from choosing crappy passwords and attackers using that?
Well,
as an attack vector?
So, hopefully, yes, but maybe not.
Love it. No.
Yes. No.
Maybe.
But I think pragmatically the reason it's become more of a thing these days is because it seems like it's the only reasonable solution for passwords, the existence of passwords, and you know the recognition that we're never going to get beyond bad passwords being used in way too many places, too many repeats, too many shared passwords, too many common passwords, things like that. So the next best thing is let's add a layer, let's do two-factor or multi-factor authentication. Now, you know, in the industry that I come from, PCI, two-factor authentication as a requirement has been around, I want to say from the very beginning, but it was limited to, like we were talking earlier, privileged accounts. And
I gotcha.
Only privileged account, non-console. In fact, the early days, if I recall correctly, it was outside of your network. So external access in administrative level had to have two-factor authentication. Now they've changed it in the standard that came out. I want to say it was with 3. It's either 3.3.1 or 3.2 because they all happen in within a year or so of each other. They've changed that because of breaches that have happened to include any access, any non-console access, admin or otherwise,
PCI
to
system,
anything in the
anything
system.
that touches the PCI system.
Yeah, because where I had trouble was when I had PCI customers that had bought the same solution that somebody was selling to the banking apps and saying, "Hey, this is great. You know, there's like 8 different things you can use." I'm like, "Yeah, but they're all the same thing."
Oh, because the banking uses the picture and other silly things.
There's there's permutations obviously, but
mostly
too
just
often they
they
were picking multiple levels of the same thing.
Yeah.
And that's because when a lot of times, right, we skip that. What's the problem we're trying to solve? Look, I said that I like the FIFA guidance. They basically said the first thing you need to do is assess your business, assess your risk, and determine if you need to move forward with it. And if you do, you need to pick the one that best fits your business and mitigates the risk. Here's the way it worked in most organizations. They called up their provider and said, "What do you got for this?" And they said, "Oh, I got this thing. It'll work." And they go, "Will the FIFIC accept it?" They go, "Well, we'll work on them. We'll get them to accept it." Okay, there you go. And enough people did that. And then they pushed back and said, "Yeah, we can't do two-factor. But we're going to do this other thing. We think it's good enough."
Yeah.
And then I worked with a group to assess. So we did a bunch of phone calls. I started saying to people, "How did you guys do the risk assessment?" The most common answer, we scheduled a meeting, got some donuts and coffee, sat around, talked about risk for an hour, decided this was a good approach. I said, did you do it before or after you bought the stuff? Oh, well, we did it after. Right. So, I mean, that's exactly what Jeff's talking about. You're looking for a solution. You're not trying to solve a problem, right? Looking for a solution is different than trying to solve a problem. Yep. So you're looking for a solution, and it comes in at the right stuff, and boom, there you go. That'll work out for me.
Well, and if they're a PCI customer, the two-factor requirement's somewhere in 8, and the risk assessment requirement isn't until you get to 12.
Mm-hmm. Well, the other thing too is no one wants to carry around another thing with them.
Right.
No one wants to carry around a dongle, the RSA security tokens.
Well, look, this is where I'm still kind of processing the question you asked about having that stuff on your phone. I mean, I've got Google Authenticator on mine. I think a lot of people have it on theirs. Mm-hmm. There's other people who make soft tokens that you can put on your phones, and that really made a lot of this a lot more accessible. Mm-hmm. Because all of a sudden now I've got the device with me as opposed to trying to have the secure ID token or some other token with me. But the reason I laughed when you asked about that at first was if anybody ever did a walk around audit, we used to do it. We'd go pull 10 random tokens, and easily half, if not almost all of them, would have the token passcode written on the little case that came with them.
Sure.
Right.
So
right.
we didn't really solve any problems there. Because if you're separated from the token and somebody gets the token, well, congratulations, they still have the passcode or password or whatever it was they needed to be able to use. So, the oddity of it is, I think now that we put it on a single device, we've made it a little bit more convenient. Are we as technically secure? I'm processing. I'm trying to figure it out.
Yeah. Well, there's also
probably not, but
there's
also
an
acceptable level of risk.
There's also implementation errors because I saw implementations of RSA where
it didn't require a passcode.
Well, no, it required a passcode, but there was like a 60-second delay, or I think you could set the delay on when it expired. So the window of opportunity to hijack it and try to replay it, and that's another setting. Does it accept a replay of it? I've already seen this token, try again, or can you simply keep replaying it and still gain access? So, they don't always solve the problem of just a replay attack. Somebody hijacking the credentials and the token, and, yes, there's a brief window of opportunity, but it's eons in the computer world of being able to replay it. Whereas I've seen other implementations where, as soon as it expires, you're done. So, if you're looking at your token and it's counting down 10 seconds, okay, I might as well wait because it's not going to go through in time, which is an inconvenience and a pain, but is more secure in theory.
But also, in speaking of implementation, I've seen it where I do my two-factor authentication and then it's like, hey, do you want to trust this device for like 30 days and we want to ask you for it again after like 30 days?
Right.
And I'm like, because that was a pain in the ass. So yes, I don't want to have to do that again.
Is there a longer time period?
So what do you guys think about the fact that NIST just came out and deprecated SMS as a second factor?
Yeah. I knew that came up this week.
Yeah, and SMS is different from the Google Authenticator, obviously.
Correct.
I think a physical token is probably the best method, although there's ways to, look, we're all security people. We know ways to get around everything, right? Or can surmise ways to get around everything at the very least.
Well, the idea, right, of SMS is it's a one-time password sent out of band.
Right. It could be intercepted.
And that's the argument, that our SMS infrastructure is akin to spaghetti in a
intercepted and spoofed and all that kind of stuff. So there is a lesser degree of security that you get with SMS. However, I feel it's still better than having just a password. I think you're going to thwart some attackers. Look, attackers on the internet are just going to guess your password, right? But if there's some kind of SMS authentication, greatly complicates the attack at scale.
Right.
In a targeted attack, they're still going to, if they're persistent, find ways around it, right? But in the general attacks on the internet, yes, SMS, the second factor, definitely helps you in that department, I think.
So there's a certain element of what's good enough, and it goes back to understanding what problem you're trying to solve. If you're, a consumer or a restricted access user, and you're using that, but given that somebody gets that, then what can they do with it? Maybe it's good enough. The fact that you're adding a layer of something else for the hacker to do might be good enough. Now, maybe that's not good enough if it's an admin account, a privileged account, or if it's an account that's logging on to some extremely sensitive, valuable type of information.
Or you're combining all of those things together in a single sign-on, like Okta, for example,
right?
And then enforcing a two-factor authentication to get into Okta. The only way to get into some of those applications is to log in through that method.
Right.
I think that's a valid solution for enterprises. I've certainly seen some good traction and read good things about Okta. I've actually used it. Mm-hmm. Some people have a love-hate relationship, but I think anytime we're talking about this level of security, there's going to be inconveniences that are introduced. So that's a natural occurrence.
Right.
Yeah, So let me point something out that I looked to. There in the show notes, there's linked out to this article at Sophos. So keep in mind, and let me just refresh people on this real fast, and then maybe this is something for us to talk about. And if you don't mind the shameless plug, I just released a free 7 steps to Straight Talk, and it guides people through it really quick. So this is all fresh in my mind. So we start by asking, what problem are we trying to solve? The next question we ask is, are we ready? And when you ask if you're ready or not, you're going to look at your structure, your infrastructure, your capacity, maybe your OpEx or CapEx budget. But one of the questions that you follow that up with almost instantly is, and why did we make that assessment? I mean, are we qualified to make that assessment? Or what are we basing it on? And one of the things that I really liked in this is they've got a line that said, well, who do you trust? And it said, on examining where people got their advice on two-factor authentication, 26% said the media was from the main source, 21% said service providers. And the reason they accepted that advice, yep, good, that's the right question, right? I mean, it may or may not be accurate, but that's the thought process. And so I actually kind of like this as an article because it helps us do that. Here's the next question you ask. What's the value? If we implement two-factor authentication, what is the value? And what is that value relative to the risk? In other words, if you're not going to create more value than the cost of implementing it, not a good solution, period. Don't spend your time on it. Question 4, how are we going to measure? And you're specifically going to look there for, how do I know it's working? How do I know that it's actually giving me the value that we said we were going to get? And then option 5 actually is, how do we communicate? And this is a perfect example of structurally, how does that communicate? How does this work with my servers? How does this work with my alerting systems? How would this work with my SIM? How would this work with all of these different things that we take a look at? And that's, so when we talk about communication, it's not how will I go sell this internally? That's a separate issue. This is saying, how does this help communication in our enterprise, or in a really technical situation like this, how would that work? Although you could also ask, when it doesn't work and the vice president of sales is really pissed off at 1 a.m. working on a big proposal and he can't get into the system, how's he going to communicate that to you beyond, hostile?
That all sounds really good, but my first thought was, but do you do that for every single piece of technology that you implement, or which I think the answer is you should, but who's going to do that? It's
Takes you an hour.
The sign of a mature IT organization. Do you walk through that process?
Look, I mean, part of the reason that I've been spending so much time on this is that I keep hearing people tell me that they don't have clarity of their focus. They don't know where they should prioritize their efforts and actions. They're getting stymied all over the place. They can't get the budget they want. They're not making a difference. Right. Okay, if you can't answer those questions, congratulations. So I would say, yeah, and look, if it's a quick back of the napkin thing, the free stuff I've got guides you through it in about an hour, and you can, once you learn it, you can go faster. But you're talking like a multi-$100,000, $1 million implementation. I'd probably spend a little time on it to make sure I got it right.
I just one thing on the study. That we linked to from Sophos was the one that reported it. It was a joint University of Maryland and Johns Hopkins University study asked 500. Johns Hopkins, thank you. Study asked 526 U.S. users questions about their security behaviors, advice sources. But I just think that's a small sample size. I don't have anything scientific to base that on, but I felt like it was small.
If you want, when you're looking at qualitative samples like this, 600 is the magic number for like 90. I don't remember the numbers, but like high 90s in terms of your percentage of accuracy. So 526 is actually not far from that. Like we're not talking massive standard deviations. Now,
closer than counts in horseshoes and hand grenades.
I didn't get into like looking at
and
how
national elections
the questions or anything else, right? And anytime you're doing something qualitative, I always like to point out qualitative stuff is great. It's good, especially if you can do it for trends. So like if they did this one year and then they did it again the next year and they did it again the third year, and you can start to see how things are changing, they're great. These are what I call perception surveys, because what you're going to get is how people perceive the question and how they perceive they should answer it. Maybe they've answered it candidly, but sometimes they try to read into what they think somebody's asking them and answer it that way. But it's still useful to take a look at. It's better than nothing, because at least you can argue for or against it. It's a starting point.
Yeah. No, I agree with you there. All righty. So that was interesting talk about multi-factor, two-factor.
So the conclusion is you should use it.
You should use it, but
if you need it.
If you need it.
If you determine if you need it, and to Jeff's point, also where you need it, right?
Yeah. Right.
Michael's like, if you need it, Jeff was more about where you need it.
It doesn't have to be like Oprah, right? Two-factor for you. Two-factor for everybody.
Two-factor for everybody. Thanks, everybody, for watching and listening to Enterprise Security Weekly. We'll see everyone next week.